North Koreans weeping uncontrollably, collapsing to the ground in despair after the death of Kim Jong-il. Is this genuine grief or a nation performing for survival? What if I told you these extreme displays are the result of decades of meticulous control, beginning in a time of war, rebellion, and brutal colonization? Today, we'll uncover the entire history of North Korea, tracing its transformation from a nation fighting for independence to the totalitarian regime we know today. By the end, you'll understand how this isolated country became a global threat and why its story matters for your future. The birth of Korea. Imagine a world where your every movement is watched, where your teachers are armed soldiers, and the air buzzes with whispers of rebellion. This was life in Korea under Japanese rule after 1905. The Empire of Japan didn't just colonize Korea, it crushed it. Every resource, every ounce of wealth was extracted to fuel Japan's growing empire. But here's the twist. Oppression breeds resistance. In Korea, that resistance came in the form of guerrilla fighters, ordinary people taking extraordinary risks. They fought valiantly, but by 1910, they were crushed. Japan had transformed Korea into a militarized colony with strict policing and unimaginable violence to keep people in line. Now here's a question. How would you fight back if you knew rebellion meant certain death? Would you risk it all? Or would you bide your time, waiting for the right moment? For Korea, the fire of rebellion wasn't extinguished. It was merely hidden, smoldering beneath the surface. By the end of World War I, calls for independence roared louder than ever. In 1919, massive protests swept the country, but the Japanese response was brutal. One horrifying example, protesters locked in a church and burned alive. That moment should have broken the Korean spirit. Instead, it fueled something new, a rise in communist ideals. The communist dream. By now, the world was changing. The Russian Revolution under Stalin had proved that communism wasn't just a theory. It was a path to revolution. For Korea, still under Japan's iron fist, communism offered a tantalizing promise, a world without imperial masters, without exploitation, where wealth was shared among the people. But while the dream of a communist utopia enchanted many, achieving it was a different story. Japanese forces cracked down on every rebel they could find, firing squads, prisons, terror. Leaders of the movement were either executed or forced to flee. One of those rebels would become the symbol of North Korea itself, a young man who fled to the mountains, harboring a dream of liberation. His name was Kim Il-sung. But how did this young revolutionary transform into a dictator, worshipped by millions? And how did a divided Korea become the stage for one of the most dangerous conflicts of the 20th century? Stick around, because what comes next will reshape the modern world. The origins of a leader, Kim Il-sung, a name that would soon dominate history. Born in 1912 near Pyongyang, Kim's early life remained shrouded in propaganda. But one truth shines through. His rise was anything but ordinary. Raised by Christian parents who fled to China, Kim was exposed to a world of resistance and revolution. In China, Kim was drawn to communism like a moth to a flame. By 1931, he was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, leading anti-Japanese protests and guerrilla strikes. His breakout moment, the Battle of Pokanbo in 1937. With 200 guerrillas under his command, Kim defeated Japanese forces, setting fire to police stations and leaving the night sky ablaze. Kim himself wrote, "The flames over Pokanbo heralded the dawn of liberation for Korea." A poetic flourish, but it was undeniable. Kim Il-sung was a rising star in the fight for independence. The Soviet connection. This newfound fame painted a target on his back. Japan unleashed its military might, forcing Kim into hiding in the Soviet Union. While there, he trained with the Red Army, perfecting his craft as both a soldier and a leader. Imagine being handpicked by Joseph Stalin himself. A terrifying honor, right? In 1945, when Japan fell to Allied forces, Kim returned to Korea. But Korea wasn't free. It was split between Soviet forces in the north and U.S. forces in the south. A simple line on a map, the 38th parallel, divided the peninsula. This artificial border would go on to define decades of conflict. In December 1945, Stalin tapped Kim as the leader of the Communist Party of Korea. His mission? Build a Soviet-aligned communist state in the north. But here's the twist. Not everyone was convinced Kim was the right man for the job. Conspiracy or control? Here's where the story takes a bizarre turn. A conspiracy theory claims that the Kim Il-sung who led North Korea was an imposter. Some say Stalin replaced the real Kim with a double, using him as a puppet to control Korea. The CIA even investigated and concluded it might be true. But modern historians and those who knew Kim personally dismissed the theory as Cold War paranoia. Real or not, Kim solidified his rule by playing one group against another. His North Korean Workers' Party introduced sweeping reforms. Land was seized from landlords and redistributed to peasants. Industries, banks, and transportation were nationalized. Women were granted equal working rights. In just a few years, North Korea's economy surged, setting the foundation for the regime's self-reliance ideology. But power always comes at a cost. Rival factions within the communist movement threatened Kim's control. Soviet-aligned Koreans wanted stronger ties with Moscow. Others, aligned with China, pushed for a Beijing-centric policy. And then there were the South Korean communists, fixated on unifying the peninsula under their ideology. To secure his dominance, Kim turned to his greatest strength, the military. He transformed his guerrilla force into the Korean People's Army, KPA, armed to the teeth with Soviet tanks, planes, and artillery. By 1948, North Korea's military was one of the strongest in the post-war world. The birth of a nation. The stage was set for a showdown. That same year, South Korea declared itself the Republic of Korea under Syngman Rhee. In response, Kim and his allies declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on September 9, 1948, with Kim as premier. North Korea was born, but this fragile nation, fueled by ideology and backed by superpowers, stood on the brink of conflict. The question was no longer if war would break out, but when. How did Kim Il-sung transform from a guerrilla fighter to a dictator feared and worshipped by millions? And what was his ultimate plan for reunifying Korea? Don't go anywhere. The next chapter reveals the explosive truth behind the Korean War. Invasion and initial triumph. Imagine standing on the brink of victory. It's June 1950, and Kim Il-sung is poised to reunify Korea under communist rule. With most American troops withdrawing, North Korea's military vastly outmatching the South, and recent communist victories worldwide, it felt like destiny was on his side. Kim had the support of the Soviet Union and China. Stalin had tested his first atomic bomb, breaking America's nuclear monopoly, and Mao's communists had taken over China. With these powers backing him, Kim launched his invasion on June 25, 1950. Within days, North Korean tanks and troops overwhelmed the South, taking Seoul in just 5 days. The poorly equipped South Korean army had no chance against the North's superior force. The collapse was catastrophic. 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or deserted. It seemed like Kim had achieved the impossible. But ask yourself, how often does the first punch end a fight? This was only the beginning. The U.S. strikes back. Kim's triumph was short-lived. The United Nations, led by the United States, condemned the invasion and mobilized forces to stop him. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. and its allies staged a daring amphibious assault at Incheon in September 1950. The surprise attack shattered North Korean defenses, turning the tide of the war almost overnight. By October, the UN forces had recaptured Seoul and pushed deep into North Korea. Pyongyang fell, and Kim Il-sung's government was forced into hiding. For North Korea, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was an existential crisis. And as the bombs began to fall, the war took a darker turn. The true devastation. North Korea's collapse on the battlefield was mirrored by the destruction raining down from the skies. The U.S. Air Force unleashed one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in history. Entire cities were flattened, villages wiped off the map, and infrastructure obliterated. By the end, 80 of North Korea's buildings were destroyed, and an estimated 10% of its population was killed. Pyongyang was reduced to rubble, so thoroughly bombed that no major buildings remained standing. This level of destruction created a scar that still defines North Korea's hatred for the U.S. today. While propaganda fuels the fire, the memory of those bombs is very real. It's a visceral wound, seared into the country's collective memory. But just as the North seemed destined for total defeat, a new player entered the game: China. China's intervention. On October 25, 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers stormed across the border in a surprise attack that caught UN forces completely off guard. They pushed the UN back across the 38th parallel, recaptured Pyongyang, and even retook Seoul briefly. For Kim Il-sung, this was both a blessing and a curse. North Korea was saved, but at a cost. China's intervention overshadowed Kim's leadership, and both Mao and Stalin blamed him for the war's failures. As the war dragged into a bloody stalemate, the Korean Peninsula became a symbol of Cold War tension, a conflict that never truly ended. But what would the next 70 years bring for Kim's regime and the divided Korea? The answers might shock you. The re-BIRTS of commentary. Imagine a nation reduced to rubble, cities leveled, infrastructure destroyed, and a population traumatized by war. This was North Korea in 1953. The Korean War had left scars far deeper than the bomb craters. It had shattered the country's economy, morale, and trust. For Kim Il-sung, it was time for a dramatic rebirth. His vision for rebuilding North Korea centered on 4 goals: consolidating communist ideology, rebuilding the economy, fortifying national defense, and reigniting the dream of reunification. But rebuilding a nation from ruins is no small feat. With over 75% of its pre-war economy wiped out, North Korea needed drastic measures to climb back from the brink. Kim's strategy was as ambitious as it was dangerous: purges and power. The first step: eliminating dissent. Kim couldn't risk the failures of the war being pinned on him. Instead, he directed blame toward his rivals. Party leaders like Ho Ka-I and Pak Han-yong were accused of sabotage, espionage, and disloyalty. Think about it. If your political enemy suddenly commits suicide under suspicious circumstances, how much would you trust the story? Hundreds of officials were executed, imprisoned, or disappeared during these purges. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It was a masterclass in consolidating power. By the late 1950s, there was no one left to challenge Kim Il-sung's rule. His dominance was absolute. But ruling wasn't enough. Kim needed an ideology to anchor the nation. In 1955, he introduced Juche, the doctrine of self-reliance. It declared North Korea's independence from foreign powers and established a society focused on self-sufficiency. To its people, Juche was sold as a source of pride. In reality, it tightened the regime's grip on every aspect of life. The cult of Kim. Juche wasn't just about the nation. It was about its leader. Kim Il-sung transformed himself into Suryong, the great leader, an almost divine figure at the center of North Korea's identity. His image became sacred, wrapping garbage in newspapers with his photo. Illegal. Printing his name on poor quality paper. A crime. This cult of personality went into overdrive, portraying Kim as a father figure who personally guided every factory worker, farmer, and soldier. Propaganda claimed he possessed unmatched wisdom, solving complex problems during his famous on-the-spot guidance visits. But not everyone embraced this new reality. In 1956, factions aligned with the Soviet Union and China openly criticized Kim's leadership. It could have been a turning point, but Kim had something they didn't: the loyalty of his people. By 1960, his enemies had vanished, Many executed, others sent to labor camps. This unchecked power would allow Kim to reshape North Korea into his vision, but it came at a devastating cost. The drive for self-reliance led to famine, suffering, and an unyielding caste system. An economy of extremes. Kim's post-war plans focused on industrialization. Through his three-year plan, 1954 to 1957, and later the five-year plan, 1957 to 1961, he emphasized heavy industry, nationalization, and collectivization. The regime celebrated Cholima, or flying horses, a propaganda campaign encouraging workers to exceed quotas at any cost. At first, the numbers looked promising. Industrial production soared, GDP surpassed the South's, and Pyongyang declared victory. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Exaggerated quotas led to lies up the chain of command. Farmers had their crops seized based on inflated numbers, leading to a hidden famine that killed an estimated 800,000 people between 1954 and 1955. Imagine working endlessly for the state, only to starve because your success was faked on paper. This was life for many North Koreans. The Songbun system. As the economy faltered, Kim turned to social control. In 1957, the Songbun system was introduced, a caste structure that classified citizens based on their loyalty to the regime. Families of revolutionaries were part of the core class, enjoying privileges like better jobs, housing, and education. But if your ancestors were landlords, religious leaders, or anti-communists, you were placed in the hostile class, destined for discrimination and hardship. This system decided everything, from career opportunities to food rations, and it still shapes North Korea today. The mirage of perfection. Amidst all this, propaganda painted North Korea as a utopia. According to state media, there was no poverty, no crime, and no disabilities because the regime fixed everything. Outsiders saw spotless streets and disciplined citizens, but the reality was far darker. What happened to those who didn't fit the image? They disappeared, hidden away, or worse. The cracks in North Korea's paradise were growing wider, even as Kim tightened his grip on power. A nation reborn or repressed. The rebirth of North Korea was a masterstroke of propaganda, power, and paranoia. Kim's vision transformed the country into a global enigma, a fiercely independent state that seemed untouchable, but hid immense suffering. But how did Kim's grip on power shape the decades to come? And what would his legacy mean for the future of North Korea? The answers will surprise you. The machinery of fear. Imagine living in a society where a single accusation, true or not, can erase you. North Korea's punishment system is designed not just to control, but to terrify. With a whisper from a higher-ranking official, you could vanish overnight, swept into the shadows of the regime's prison and labor camps. Trials. Don't expect fairness. They are ideological performances where guilt is predetermined. Judges berate the accused as traitors to the nation before handing down inevitable sentences. Years of imprisonment, hard labor, or worse. These are not prisons in the traditional sense. They are tools of the state to break bodies, minds, and spirits. Here's a chilling thought. In North Korea, what counts as a crime? Wearing jeans, watching foreign movies, or simply failing to cry hard enough during a state funeral? Could you survive in a system where loyalty is measured by fear? Labor camps, factories of despair. North Korea's prisons draw heavy inspiration from Stalin's infamous gulags. These are not just places of punishment. They are labor camps where inmates toil to produce goods or extract raw materials for the regime. Hard labor isn't just a sentence, it's a philosophy. The state claims this grueling work re-educates prisoners, instilling loyalty and work ethic. But the reality? These camps are factories of despair. Food is scarce, living conditions are brutal, and guards dole out bearings without hesitation. One former guard revealed that at least a third of inmates were mutilated, fingers, ears, and eyes lost to punishment. Imagine a system where humanity is so stripped away that guards are told, "These are not people. They have no rights." For those deemed unfit for re-education, there are the Kwanliso, North Korea's concentration camps. These house political prisoners, critics, defectors, and even their families. Guilt by association is standard. In these camps, the goal is not rehabilitation, but elimination through isolation and hard labor. A legacy of terror. The punishment system isn't just about maintaining control. It's about sending a message. Every arrest, every beating, every execution sends shockwaves through society. It ensures that even a fleeting thought of dissent is crushed before it begins. But here's the deeper question. How does a regime sustain this level of fear for decades? And what happens to a society that lives under such oppression? As North Korea entered the 1960s, the machinery of terror was fully operational, but cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. The cost of survival. North Korea's punishment system is a chilling reminder of how far a regime will go to preserve power. It's not just about punishing crime. It's about creating fear so pervasive that no one dares to question authority. But even in a system built on fear, no government is invincible. How did Kim Il-sung's North Korea navigate the challenges of the 1960s? And what new threats would test the regime's grip on power? Stay tuned to uncover the next chapter in this dark saga. Economic ambitions and Western tech. The 1960s brought a bold new vision for North Korea. Kim Il-sung, determined to transform the nation into a model of industrial and military power, made an unthinkable move. He turned to the West. North Korea's economy needed more than juke ideals. It needed machinery and technology. While the Soviet Union had been a primary supplier, disagreements over costs led Kim to look elsewhere. By the mid-1960s, North Korea was importing billions of dollars worth of equipment from Western nations, including Japan. Pyongyang even used this technology to build the world's largest cement factory and other key industrial facilities. But here's the twist. North Korea wasn't paying. They bought on credit, with no intention of repaying their debts. This brief flirtation with Western trade collapsed when the world realized the Hermit Kingdom's checkbook was a fiction. A strange defection. James Dresnok. Amid this growing interaction with the West, a bizarre story unfolded. In 1962, James Joseph Dresnok, a disillusioned U.S. soldier stationed in South Korea, decided he had enough. After a troubled life of failed relationships, legal issues, and despair, he crossed the DMZ into North Korea, seeking what he thought would be a better life. North Korea welcomed Dresnok and used him as propaganda gold. He became a teacher and even acted in North Korean films, portraying American soldiers. Dresnok remained in North Korea for the rest of his life, raising children who now hold prominent roles in the regime. Think about the desperation that would drive someone to defect into one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Dresnok's story is a haunting reminder of how despair can push people to make unimaginable choices. A military reborn. Kim Il-sung didn't just rebuild his military, he made it a cornerstone of North Korean life. By the 1960s, every citizen was expected to serve at least 8 years in the armed forces. Even children as young as 7 were trained with firearms. The military wasn't just a tool of defense, it was a symbol of juche. Kim envisioned a self-sufficient North Korea capable of producing all the tanks, planes, and rifles it needed. The government slogan, arms in one hand, hammer and sickle in the other. But the militarization of society wasn't without consequence. Kim purged top generals in the late 1960s, removing anyone who might challenge his control. The regime grew tighter, more paranoid, and more isolated. The Second Korean War. As tensions simmered, Kim turned to guerrilla warfare to destabilize the South. Starting in 1966, the DMZ erupted into violence. North Korean infiltrators crossed the border almost daily, engaging in firefights with South Korean and U.S. forces. One of the boldest moments came in 1968 with the Blue House raid. Kim sent 31 elite commandos to assassinate South Korea's president, Park Chung-hee. They got within 800 meters of their target before being discovered. A chaotic firefight ensued, and South Korean forces hunted down all but one of the commandos. The Blue House raid wasn't Kim's only provocation. Just days later, North Korea captured the U.S. Pueblo, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance ship, taking its crew hostage. This combination of audacious actions brought the peninsula dangerously close to war. Progress amid paranoia. Despite these military missteps, North Korea's economy appeared to be thriving. By the 1970s, its GDP per capita rivaled the South's. Urbanization surged, electricity reached most homes, and the education system expanded, with free tuition and hundreds of universities. One of North Korea's proudest achievements was its healthcare system. Vaccination programs and mandatory checkups led to a high life expectancy for its economic status, around 73 years, a rare bright spot in the regime's otherwise harsh reality. But for the average North Korean, prosperity remained a dream. Kim promised luxury for all, silk clothing, tiled roofs, and 3 meals a day. For millions in the West, this was already reality. For North Koreans, it was propaganda masking a grimmer truth. The tipping point. By the mid-1970s, cracks began to form in Kim's vision. The debts from Western imports loomed large and economic growth was slowing. The militarization of society, while providing short-term benefits, was draining resources. The 1960s and early 1970s marked a period of bold ambition for North Korea, a time of industrial progress and military growth. But beneath the surface, the regime's foundations were beginning to weaken. As the world entered the 1980s, North Korea faced a new wave of challenges. How would Kim Il-sung's regime adapt to an increasingly interconnected and competitive world? And how did these choices shape the isolated nation we know today? Stay tuned to find out. Economic decline and illusions of prosperity. By the early 1970s, North Korea's economy was unraveling. The Cholima movement, once a symbol of rapid industrial growth, had burned out its workforce and production began to decline. The 1973 oil crisis only worsened the situation, and by 1976, North Korea had defaulted on its debts to the West. To maintain the illusion of success, the regime resorted to manipulating statistics. While industries like ceramics flourished, underperforming sectors were buried in propaganda. Pyongyang's leadership continued pouring resources into overachieving sectors, ignoring the glaring holes elsewhere. Here's the irony. Even as factories churned out goods, quality was so poor that items had to be remade, creating a vicious cycle of inefficiency. Yet, life in the 1970s wasn't all bad, at least in the beginning. Housing projects eased shortages, and North Korea still enjoyed some industrial and agricultural growth. But by the decade's end, the nation had fallen far behind its rivals, particularly South Korea, which was racing ahead economically. North Korea was becoming increasingly dependent on Soviet subsidies, turning into a virtual vassal state. Foreign policy, friends and foes. Globally, North Korea faced a changing political landscape. The Vietnam War's end gave Kim Il-sung hope for reunification, but China and the Soviet Union weren't interested in backing another Korean war. Beijing, in particular, was pursuing warmer relations with the West, and supporting Pyongyang's military ambitions would ruin those efforts. Kim found unlikely allies in dictators like Idi Amin of Uganda and Francisco Macias Nguema of Equatorial Guinea. Nguema, infamous for his brutality, even sent his daughter to be raised in Pyongyang, calling Kim her second father. This relationship epitomized North Korea's bizarre alliances, friendships forged with some of the world's most ruthless regimes. But while Kim sought allies abroad, tensions at home escalated, with the DMZ becoming a flashpoint for violence. Operation Paul Bunyan, a fight over a tree. One of the most bizarre and dangerous moments of the Cold War occurred in 1976 when a tree in the DMZ sparked an international crisis. On August 18, 1976, U.S. and South Korean soldiers entered the DMZ to trim a tree obstructing their view. They were confronted by North Korean soldiers who demanded they stop. When Captain Arthur Boniface turned his back, the North Koreans attacked. Armed with crowbars and axes, they brutally killed Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett. North Korean propaganda spun the incident as a victory against U.S. aggression. But the U.S. response was anything but submissive. Enter Operation Paul Bunyan, a military operation named after a lumberjack. The U.S. brought overwhelming force. Hundreds of armed soldiers, tanks, helicopters, bombers, and even an aircraft carrier were mobilized. Under this massive show of strength, the tree was cut down in 45 minutes while North Korean soldiers watched helplessly. Though Kim Il-sung expressed regret over the incident, the operation sent a clear message. The U.S. would not back down, even over a tree. A deadly gamble on the future. Urgency grips the world as North Korea pursues ultimate power. The 1990s marked the beginning of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. With dwindling energy resources and mounting paranoia, they sought nuclear weapons, forcing the world to the brink of war. A dramatic confrontation in 1993 saw a North Korean diplomat threaten to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. And then, in 1994, a moment that promised hope. North Korea scaled back its nuclear program, thanks to U.S. negotiations led by Jimmy Carter. Was this the beginning of a more cooperative North Korea? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. North Korea had one more wild card, a new leader who'd take things to extremes. The death of a god. The curtain falls, but the drama only intensifies. In July 1994, Kim Il-sung, the architect of modern North Korea, died. His death was a national event, with millions weeping in the streets. But was it grief or fear? In a nation where failing to cry could mean prison, the lines between loyalty and coercion blurred. His son, Kim Jong-il, stepped into power, inheriting a fragile economy, growing isolation, and the weight of his father's ideology. For North Koreans, hope dimmed as the state clung to its nuclear ambitions, even as millions starved. So what happens when desperation, ambition, and isolation collide? The answer lies in what came next. A North Korea armed with nuclear weapons and a leader who redefined defiance. North Korea's history isn't just a tale of tragedy. It's a warning, a story of how unchecked ambition and isolation can drive a nation to the brink. If this fascinates you, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's the blueprint for decisions we make today. What can we learn from North Korea? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you chills, and subscribe for more stories that challenge how you see the world. Imagine a nation where fear is policy, ambition is limitless, and every move is a gamble with lives and legacies. This is the story of North Korea, a tale of tragedies, towering ambitions, and chilling warnings for the world. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll see how this small nation shaped history in ways that ripple even today. Terror takes to the skies. A single act of terror can shake nations. But what drives such madness? In 1987, Korean Air Flight 858 became a symbol of North Korea's dangerous tactics. Two agents, on orders from Kim Jong-il himself, planted a bomb disguised as a radio. They left the plane during a stopover in Abu Dhabi, leaving 115 unsuspecting passengers to continue their journey. Hours later, the bomb detonated over the Andaman Sea, claiming every life on board. Why? The regime wanted to terrorize the world ahead of the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Fear, after all, is a powerful weapon. One of the agents, Kim Hyun-hui, survived her own suicide attempt and later confessed. She had been indoctrinated from childhood to serve the regime. The attack outraged the international community. The United States officially labeled North Korea a terrorist state. but the regime denied involvement, despite undeniable evidence. Here's the kicker. North Korea wasn't just interested in scaring the world. They were obsessed with distracting their own people. Vanity projects and poverty. When ambition overshadows reason, the results are colossal and disastrous. During the 1980s, North Korea poured billions into vanity mega projects. Some, like the Nampo Dam, became engineering marvels, providing water and a rare sense of national pride. Others, like the Ryugyong Hotel, became embarrassing symbols of waste. The 1,000-foot pyramid-shaped skyscraper was supposed to attract tourists and foreign investment. Instead, it became an unfinished monument to failure. These projects masked the grim reality. North Korea was crumbling. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and China's economic liberalization left Pyongyang increasingly isolated. The regime doubled down on its ideology of self-reliance, or juche, cutting itself off from the world even further. But when a nation is desperate, it turns to extremes, and for North Korea, that meant nuclear weapons. The nuclear gamble. When survival is at stake, the line between ambition and desperation blurs. By the 1990s, North Korea sought protection in nuclear weapons. The world watched in alarm as the regime withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1993. A North Korean diplomat even threatened to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. Despite the threats, negotiations temporarily halted their ambitions. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter secured an agreement for North Korea to scale back its nuclear program in exchange for aid. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Kim Il-sung even agreed to an unprecedented meeting with South Korea's president. But hope is a fragile thing in North Korea, and the world was about to learn just how fragile. The death of a dynasty's god. When a leader becomes a god, his death shakes a nation to its core. In 1994, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, died of a massive heart attack. The regime had prepared for this moment for years, but the people, many had never known life without their great leader. Factories halted, schools paused, and millions flooded Pyongyang for his funeral. Was the grief real or a product of fear and indoctrination? It's impossible to tell. For some, his death was the loss of a father figure. For others, it marked the end of a dictator who had caused millions of deaths through war, famine, and oppression. His son, Kim Jong-il, inherited not only power, but a fractured nation. Poverty deepened, and the nuclear program re-emerged as North Korea's ultimate gamble for survival. The death of Kim Il-sung marked the end of an era, but under Kim Jong-il, the world would see a North Korea more isolated and more dangerous than ever before. North Korea's story is more than a history lesson. It's a warning. The pursuit of power at all costs comes with a price. But here's the question. Will North Korea's obsession with control and isolation ultimately lead to its downfall? The myth of Kim Jong-il. Can a lie be powerful enough to sustain a regime? When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, his son Kim Jong-il took the reins. But there was a problem. Kim lacked his father's revolutionary legacy. So North Korea's propaganda machine worked overtime to craft the myth of Kim Jong-il. He wasn't just a leader, he was a legend. Born under a double rainbow on a sacred mountain, his birth supposedly heralded by a new star in the sky. According to official accounts, he wrote hundreds of operas, scored perfect games in bowling and golf on his first attempts, and bizarrely, never needed to use the bathroom. But behind the myths lay a more complex figure. Privately, Kim was obsessed with Western films, indulged in luxury, and fathered multiple children with various mistresses. The propaganda painted him as a godlike figure, but reality would soon challenge his abilities. Let's be honest, who wouldn't want to be remembered as the inventor of the hamburger? That's one claim even McDonald's can't top. The famine and the arduous march. When the leader fails, the people pay the price. North Korea's fragile economy faced its breaking point in the mid-1990s. Floods destroyed crops, and with Soviet aid long gone, the country spiraled into what was euphemistically called the Arduous March. But make no mistake, it was a famine. Millions starved. Families roamed the countryside in search of food, and black markets became lifelines. But instead of addressing the crisis, Kim focused on suppressing dissent. The Shimajo, a secret police force, silenced anyone who dared speak of starvation. Over 10,000 people were executed, and thousands more vanished into concentration camps. By the late 1990s, international aid finally began to stem the crisis, but not before hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, had died. Even in this catastrophe, Kim refused to acknowledge reality, blaming local officials and insisting on self-reliance over practical solutions. If this famine taught Kim anything, it wasn't compassion. It was how to tighten his grip on power. The military first doctrine, jong-un. When a nation arms itself to the teeth, who really pays the price? In the wake of the famine, Kim embraced jong-un, or military first policy. The military became the centerpiece of North Korean society. Resources were diverted to the army, and citizens were expected to emulate military discipline and loyalty in their daily lives. This focus on militarization wasn't just about defense, it was about control. Propaganda painted soldiers as the heroes of the revolution, and even civilians were cast as warriors in the fight against North Korea's enemies. But while the military flourished, the rest of the economy stagnated. Even when North Korea dabbled with market reforms in 2002, these changes were largely cosmetic, legalizing black markets that had already existed for years. Efforts like the Kaesong industrial complex hinted at economic cooperation with the South, but they were more about optics than real change. It's ironic, isn't it? For a country so obsessed with self-reliance, they sure relied on foreign aid, and even capitalist investments, to stay afloat. Nuclear ambitions and provocations. When diplomacy fails, fear becomes currency. Kim's obsession with the military extended to nuclear weapons. By 2002, the CIA believed North Korea had at least one nuclear bomb. Despite international agreements, North Korea continued developing its nuclear program, leveraging it for economic aid. The first successful nuclear test came in 2006, and while it showcased North Korea's growing capabilities, it didn't solve the country's deeper problems. Instead, it invited sanctions, further isolating the regime. Meanwhile, Kim's reign was punctuated by violent skirmishes with South Korea. In 2010, the sinking of the South Korean warship jong-un, likely by a North Korean torpedo, killed 46 sailors and escalated tensions. Later that year, North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island, killing civilians and soldiers alike. These provocations left the world on edge, but as Kim's health declined, his regime faced a new challenge, one it couldn't control. Economic chaos and the end of an era. Even dictators can't escape the consequences of bad decisions. In 2009, North Korea attempted disastrous currency reforms, wiping out people's savings and plunging the economy into chaos. Inflation soared, and even loyal government workers found themselves unable to afford basic goods. For the first time, widespread public anger bubbled to the surface. The regime scrambled to stabilize the situation, scapegoating officials and rolling back policies. But the damage was done, exposing cracks in Kim's carefully controlled system. In 2011, Kim Jong-il's reign came to an end with his sudden death, reportedly from a heart attack.
김정일 동지께서 주체 100 2011년 12월 17일 8시 30분에 현지 지도의 길에서
His funeral mirrored that of his father, elaborate and emotional, with the people weeping in the streets. But unlike Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il left a legacy of famine, economic mismanagement, and international isolation. Kim Jong-il's reign was a testament to the power of propaganda and the limits of paranoia. While his father built a nation, Kim presided over its decline, leaving his successor, Kim Jong-un, with a fragile, isolated state. What can we learn from this? Power built on fear is never sustainable. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lessons of history. The world watches North Korea, not because it's a major player, but because it's a wild card. From failed spy satellite launches to warming ties with Russia and the rare defection of an American soldier, North Korea in 2023 to 2024 reminds us that this enigmatic nation is as unpredictable as ever. But what's next? Stick around to explore the country's uncertain future and what it means for the world. 2023, a year of missiles, mishaps, and headlines. North Korea's greatest weapon isn't its missiles, it's its unpredictability. In 2023, North Korea continued its missile tests and fiery rhetoric. Threats of annihilating the US and South Korea, business as usual. But let's focus on the highlights. Failed spy satellite launches. In May and August, North Korea attempted to launch its first spy satellite, leveraging its ICBM technology. Both launches failed spectacularly, with rockets crashing into the sea. These failures are embarrassing for Pyongyang, but highlight their determination to achieve militarized surveillance capabilities. Defection of Travis King. In July, a U.S. soldier made headlines by defecting across the DMZ. Travis King blamed racism and mistreatment in the U.S., but his legal troubles likely played a role. By September, North Korea released him back to U.S. custody, leaving many to question what this brief, bizarre episode means for international relations. And then there's the Russia connection. Kim Jong-un met with Vladimir Putin in September to discuss supplying weapons for the war in Ukraine. North Korea views this as more than an arms deal. It's a chance to align against its shared enemies, the US and NATO. It's worth asking, is this a desperate attempt to stay relevant or a calculated move to leverage global instability? The future of the Hermit Kingdom. To reform or not to reform? That is North Korea's eternal question. North Korea faces two possible futures: stay the course or embrace reform. But both paths are fraught with peril. No reform. Refusing to change means falling further behind the world. North Korea's stagnant economy, crumbling infrastructure, and reliance on outdated technology make collapse seem inevitable. Mismanaged reform. Opening up too quickly or mishandling change could destabilize the regime entirely. Even Kim Jong-un seems to recognize this. His subtle moves, like promoting tourism, embracing limited foreign culture, and dabbling in modern technology, hint at the possibility of change. But let's not forget, the regime continues to tighten its grip on citizens. Border security is stricter than ever. Nuclear threats remain central to its strategy. These contradictions show that while Kim might flirt with modernization, he's not ready to relinquish the tools of control that have kept his family in power for decades. Can North Korea truly modernize while clinging to its oppressive past? Or will these contradictions ultimately tear it apart? North versus South, a tale of two Koreas. The starkest border in the world isn't just physical, it's economic. The divide between North and South Korea is staggering. Consider this: per capita income, South Korea's is 15 times higher than the North's, the largest income disparity between two bordering nations in the world. For comparison, West Germany's income was only 3 times that of East Germany before the Berlin Wall fell. Cultural shock. For defectors, the transition from North to South is overwhelming. Modern technology, freedom of speech, and access to resources are unrecognizable to those who've spent their lives in the North. This gap isn't just about economics. It's a living testament to the failure of North Korea's policies. And yet, the regime endures, propped up by propaganda, fear, and a relentless focus on self-preservation. North Korea is a relic of a bygone era, yet it persists. Whether it reforms, collapses, or continues its strange status quo, its future remains a global question mark. One thing is clear: The world isn't just watching North Korea, it's learning from it. As global tensions rise, the Hermit Kingdom stands as both a cautionary tale and a wild card. What do you think? Is reform possible for North Korea, or is collapse inevitable? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you new insights, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the lessons hidden in history and geopolitics. Thanks for watching.